So today is selection and onboarding in our series of workshops on skills-based hiring. This comes to us from the Markle Foundation, which is a nonprofit that has a contract with the state of Indiana to bring the Skillful program to next level jobs and the Department of Workforce Development. This training is worth 2 professional development credits if you are SHRM CP or SHRM SCP certified. You could reach out to me for the activity ID, and I will hook you up with that so that you can get your professional development credits. A little bit about me real quick. Again, my name is Chad. I work for CareSource. In particular, the Life Services Division, in particular, the program Job Connect. And I always have to do a little bit explaining about that because people are like, CareSource is like, that's like a healthcare company, right? So what are you doing talking about jobs? Fair question, fair question. So I have spent 20 years in different HR related functions, particularly talent acquisition. Essentially what I'm doing for CareSource is workforce development for Medicaid. So we have our Life Services Division, which is where our program Job Connect is, and it is focused on social determinants of health. So that's essentially everything that happens that affects your health that doesn't happen inside of a doctor's office. Some of those things are more obvious, like nutrition. Others not so obvious, but definitely part of your well-being. Things like your housing situation, transportation, childcare, even things like employment and education. In fact, especially employment and education. That is our focus in Job Connect. So Sally says that she just saw a commercial on CareSource about helping with job search. That's me. So if you call that number or go on that website, they will connect you to our program Job Connect. And they will connect you to our team of job coaches. I support them in a partner-facing manner, so I don't really work directly with members. I connect our coaches to opportunities with our partners, many of whom are on the call today. So thank you so much for being here. So that's what a healthcare company is doing in workforce development. We have found that if we take care of the whole person, including employment and education, they are happier and they are healthier. And quite frankly, that costs us less money too when people take care of themselves. So we'd like to see all of the members in the CareSource family. We have 2 million members in Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and a few other states. Here in Indiana, we primarily service the Healthy Indiana Plan and Hoosier Healthwise, and we want to see those folks happy and healthy. So having a good job is so important to that. So this really resonates with me, this talent workshop, because I myself, in particular today's session on selection and onboarding, because I have worked for HR managers that made decisions on new hires that to me seemed somewhat subjective and arbitrary. I remember one job I had, we had a other category for rejecting candidates, and that category, anytime someone was not a good fit, right? No more of that, no more vague, not a good fit. We are going to make sure that we are picking the best person for the job, and also that we have an ironclad process to protect us from questions and accusations about bias in our hiring practices. So that's where we are. We are on 103. Quick poll. Have you attended workshop 1 or 2? I'm launching that poll right now. Just give me an idea of what your familiarity is with this, so I don't talk over your head or conversely mansplain too much. Let me know. Have you attended either workshop 1 or 2? Chris saw the overview presentation at MCRC. Excellent. This is a little bit deeper dive today. And it looks like most people have done the poll, and overwhelmingly, the answer is no. People have not attended. Let's share those results. So it looks like over 3/4 of the room have not attended Skillful Talent Series 1 or 2. That is okay. That is okay, because we're going to do a quick recap before we get into the part that's specific to what we're talking about today. No problem at all. Also, I emailed out a spreadsheet in an Outlook calendar invite yesterday that you will need for today. You'll need to be able to open that spreadsheet. So go ahead and grab that out of your email and open that. And we will walk through the activities that we're going to do today inside that spreadsheet. If you need it, just say so in the chat, and I or someone else will upload the copy that was sent out for that. Also, this is super not formal. So you can ask questions at any time, interrupt me, whatever you'd like to do. Claudia is asking for a copy of the spreadsheet in the chat. I'm going to try to upload that right now. Although I will tell you that sometimes I have trouble. Okay, it looks like it went in. One of the side effects of working for CareSource is they're super locked down on file sharing. So sometimes I can't share stuff from my computer because of HIPAA. They're super careful about sharing files. So it looks like that went through in the chat. So see if you can grab it from the chat, Claudia and others who need. The other thing I can do is email it. If you put your email address in the chat, I can try to email it as well, but try to grab it out of the chat. It looks like it went through. It's called, oh, you know what? I think that maybe I sent the wrong one. That looks like the 102 version. So that is, yep, sorry. Let's give you the most recent version, shall we? Okay, so disregard the one that I just sent. Here is the one that you really want. There we go. So it's called Step-by-Step Hiring Guide Recruiter Example. So this is our basic skills-based hiring guide template adapted for the example of a specific position, which is the position of recruiter. And that's the one that we're going to use for today as an example. So it's that second one that I just put in the chat, not the one that says 102, the one that says Step-by-Step Hiring Guide Recruiter Example. I emailed that out yesterday, so grab that from your email or open that from the chat because you're going to want to have that handy. And as I said, today is super informal. Anytime you want to chat, you want to unmute, you can even annotate the screen. I believe I have that set up where you can actually write on the screen as well. So feel free to do any of those things, and we're going to move forward. So again, we are on workshop 103. So a quick recap of what we did in the first two. Again, I will send out links and videos. So in the first one, we introduced the concept of skills-based hiring, starting with the job descriptions, primarily by defining competencies. And then we're going to move forward with those competencies to evaluate and select candidates based on that skills-based approach. So in 102, we set up the tools to do that. So interviews and pre-screening assessments, work assignments, all those parts of the screening process that we use in skills-based hiring. Today, we cover a skills-based framework for selecting candidates and getting them started on the path to success with 90-day onboarding. We will then segue into more of that in 104, which is on July 8th. Mark your calendars. That is going to be the most popular one in the series, I am sure, because it focuses on employee retention. We all know it is much cheaper to keep an employee than to hire a new one. The main reason people leave for attrition and turnover lack of career development, not necessarily because they're not getting promoted. So there are a number of ways to engage and retain your workforce. That's what we talk about in 104, and it is a very popular workshop. So we expect a huge number of people to be there for that one on July 8th, and I hope you're in that room as well. So a good way to start this conversation is to look at the example of a recruiter. So in the state of Indiana, we've got an active workforce of, let's say around 3.4 million. As you will see on the screen today, we are, just by using traditional hiring practices, we are excluding almost everyone who might be eligible for that role, including myself. So this is how I mentioned earlier that this program really resonates with me. That's because I myself am a product of skills-based hiring. So I used to work for a nonprofit in Bloomington. I was actually a public radio journalist for a decade, and then I was promoted to director of the public radio station that I worked for. So when I left that job, I had to figure out what's next for me. I don't really want to keep running a public radio station, and there's only like 7 of those jobs in the state of Indiana anyway. So I had to really examine, what did I do in the last 13 years in my career? And where can I go with that, right? So I didn't know this term of skills-based hiring, but I am certainly a product of it, because when I sat down with workforce development people and I sat down with HR friends, they said, okay, let's sketch out, what did you actually do at that job? And I talked a lot about managing the human capital of the organization. I had to recruit volunteers and interns. I had to onboard them. I had to train them. I had to manage them. I had to evaluate them. And some of those, a bunch of those friends said, dude, you were in HR. You were basically the HR director for that organization. I was like, I guess you're right. I guess I was. So I completely reframed my resume into skills-based competencies, and I put myself out there for HR jobs, and relatively quickly I got one, even though I had no degree in HR. My degree, from my IU degree, is actually in journalism, because I started as a public radio journalist. So right here, what you see on the screen, I would have been eliminated right off the bat. Along with 75% of other Hoosiers, I would have immediately been eliminated from the consideration for recruitment and talent acquisition, because I didn't have that HR degree. Another 30% will be eliminated by bias. We will talk about how bias, sometimes intentional, but mostly unintentional bias, creeps into the hiring process. Then let's say for recruiter, we want 1 year of HR experience. That will eliminate 93% of the remaining applicants. Only a small subsection of the labor force has that experience. And then, of course, some people just are not considering changing employment. So that will eliminate another 30%. So you see now we are down to less than 1% of the Indiana labor force would be available for this recruiter position that we are using as the example for this workshop today, including myself. So I have done various HR functions for almost exactly 20 years now. And it was only last year through CareSource that I became SHRM CP certified. And that was my first formal credential in human resources. So I myself am a product of skills-based hiring. So I feel very passionate about this stuff. So the basic definition of what the shift that we're trying to make in the Indiana workforce is going from credential to competency. So historically, traditional hiring practices are credential-based. So they require things like degrees, certifications, and a specific number of years of work experiences. It's very common to require that in a job posting, but it communicates expectations of skill level that aren't necessarily there and aren't the only ways to get those skills that you would need for this position. So there's a misconception, for example, if you have a degree in HR, that you have a certain level of knowledge in HR, probably. Maybe though, not necessarily true. We all know college is what we make it. Some of us focus on it very tightly. Some of us just barely get through. Credentials eliminate other pathways for skill development and don't really clearly communicate skill delivery expectations. Credentials are exclusive. They're limiting. So instead, we want to look at competencies. So competencies, you guys all know KSAs, right? Knowledge, skills, abilities. These reflect a candidate's ability to actually perform the specific activities and tasks that you need for a job. This is a much more inclusive way to hire because they do not prescribe a specific way, a specific degree, a specific job that you had to have before in order to gain a skill. So it basically casts a wider net and says if you've got the right competencies, you are qualified for the position. Also, when we talk about competencies, we want to reframe a couple terms that are also legacy, traditional, historic terms in HR. You guys have heard of soft skills, right? So soft skills are now rebranded as foundational skills. The term soft skills can actually be kind of misleading. Foundational competencies are things like public speaking, critical thinking, collaboration, stuff that you can generally transfer from job to job and even from industry to industry, but they're hard to train for unless you're really intentional about the process. If foundational competencies are not the main hiring focus, you might end up missing out on some people that have some really important skills for the job that you're looking for. Occupational competencies, and that's what we used to call technical skills, right? Things that are specific to an industry or a position. So for example, if you're in IT, coding, if you work in factories, manufacturing processes, those are specific to that occupation. In healthcare, patient care, obviously, is specific to those clinical roles in healthcare. And it's really super common for companies to hire primarily for occupational competencies, when really those are highly trainable. So going back to my own example of having the foundational skills in HR, but not knowing really a dang thing about, for example, employment law, as you see on the screen, that's okay, because I found an employer that embraced the skills-based approach and said, you know what, you're familiar with applicant tracking systems a little, we can train you on ours. You have a little familiarity with employment law, we can train you on what you need to know for our specific situation, as long as you have those foundational skills that will make you successful in this role. So, quick summary, skills-based hiring. The first thing that we want to do is remove credential requirements whenever possible. Now, some jobs you can't. So think, nursing, a lawyer, obviously, you have to pass the state bar, right? So we're not trying to say credentials aren't any good. Some of them are it's not possible to remove them. But when you include credentials, we want to make sure that you also are including competencies as well. Most jobs use credentials as such as work experience, degrees as the main qualifications. We're saying let's shift that paradigm. Let's move to a skills-based approach that looks at competencies, not credentials. So defining the right competencies for the job, that's super important. Because if you do this process right, you're going to use them to the entire hiring process, not just attracting and evaluating and selecting candidates, but then putting them on a path to consistent long-term success. The other nice side benefit in this is that we reduce bias in the entire hiring process because we are going to set up processes that are ironclad, that are not subjective, that are not a matter of opinion, and that's going to help us to reduce racism, ageism, classism, all isms as we take a skills-based approach to screening, interviewing, and assessing. So those are the three keys to skills-based hiring. For today, what we're focusing on is the selection process and a little bit about the onboarding process as well. But we're going to show you kind of a formula for how to set up teams for success and use skills-based job descriptions to set up skills-based selection guidelines so that everyone's on the same page and that we are judging candidates based on how well they have demonstrated the competencies that we need for that position. So that's today's focus. Let's start with an activity. So I'm going to give you the name of a job. I'm going to give you the occupation. In the chat, I want you to write the first word that comes to mind. You can also annotate the screen if you know how to do that. You can just write it right on the screen. That would be fine too if you know how to annotate. But you can also just put it in the chat as well. So I'm going to give you a job title, and you tell me the first word that comes to mind. Bus driver. When you hear that occupation, bus driver, what's the first word that pops into mind? I'm seeing safety, reliable, careful. I see a couple of people say school. That's the first one that I thought of. That's Scott says kids going crazy. Responsible, public transportation. Okay, so now we're starting to get somewhere here. So bus driver, we had some people say school. We had some people say public transportation. I thought school right away. Okay, let's do one more. Let's do one more. Word association number 2. Software developer. When you hear that title, what's the first word you think of? I'm seeing IT, computers. Brooke said smart. Probably smarter than me for sure. Oh, Sandra said that too. Geek, Scott. Okay, very interesting. I think you guys are, I think you're getting where I'm coming from with this. So what do you think the significance is that we all had these different associations? Notice what John said, introvert, IT, geek, intel. Notice that there's such a variety of words that we are associating with these. I thought school right away, and then for bus driver, and then thinking about later, I'm like, well, only a fraction of people who drive buses work for a school and drive a school bus specifically. Why did I make that association? So the point here is that we all bring our own preconceived ideas and experiences to everything we do. It's totally natural, including how we make connections to the words that we hear. Unfortunately, these preconceptions are the root of unintentional bias. We don't even mean to do it. We make associations, we connect the dots. The human brain wants to connect the dots, and we do that pretty naturally. Okay, so going back to workshop 1 for just a second, I want to show you a side-by-side comparison of the old way to recruit for a recruiter and the new way that we're talking about now. So this is a pedigree qualification. This is an actual job posting. And the point is, from this exercise we just did, words matter, right? And there's some words in this job description, an actual job description, soliciting applicants for a recruiter, which again is the position we're going to use for the training today. Anybody notice are there any words that jump out to you on this one that bother you or that you think might be problematic? Again, you can chat. You can also unmute. It's fine if you guys want to talk. If anyone wants to talk, just unmute yourself and shout out what issues. Do you see any issues? Requires minimum, says Jolene. Yes, minimum of 1 year of experience working in a recruit. So, okay, 364 days doesn't cut it, right? We need 1 year. That 1 day is gonna. If I have 364 days, you're not gonna hire me. Sense of urgency and analytical, says Chris. Okay, so some of these words, they're well-meaning. You know, they're trying to get across actual skills and competencies that you do need. But you know, like Chris says, what does analytical even mean, right? And in fact, studies show that there is actually gender bias in the term analytical, because studies show this, men tend to overestimate or be overconfident in their analytical skills. Women tend to undervalue and underestimate their analytical skills. So there's an inherent gender bias in that. There's age bias in this as well. And again, I don't think the person that wrote this meant to do that, but when you use words like energetic, confident, go-getter, there's age bias. A candidate who is older is going to self-select out of that. They're going to think, oh, what they're really saying is they want a young person for this job. I can't do this. There's also cultural bias in this pedigree qualifications list. Some that, again, we may not even realize. So when you use words like dynamic, you know, in some cultures, you know, being dynamic is aggressive. You know, that is not how some cultures handle business relationships. So there's a number of issues. The use of credentials, requiring a specific degree, 1 year of experience, not 364 days, only 365. Also specifying Workday as an applicant tracking system. Listen, guys, I've used all the major ATS systems, mostly UltiPro and Workday. They're 95% all the same, right? If you've worked with one, you could easily be trained on another. So this is a fairly exclusionary pedigree job list. Now I want you to look, and I'll stay on this one for a minute because I really want you to read this. This is what we came up with in workshop 1. So we redefined the role of a recruiter to be skills-based. So I'm going to stay on this slide for just a second so you can read this. Notice that we have removed credentials. Now, again, there's some jobs you can't do that for. You know, if you're like any of our healthcare partners and you're hiring CNA, got to have a CNA license, right? But you need to bolster that with competencies, even if you do require certification. For a recruiter, you should take a no wrong door approach. Heck, I'm a perfect example. I climbed in through the window of HR. I didn't walk in the front door. I didn't have that degree. And I've had a long and fulfilling career in HR, even though I climbed in the window. So notice that there also, in defining this as competencies, notice the distinction between required competencies and preferred competencies. This is super important. This is super important. That gives clarity to the job seeker on what's most important, and it's also going to inform what we do today as well in this workshop. Also notice that the competencies are defined in a way that tells you how you will use that competency in this advertised position. That's very important for what we're doing today too, because we're going to evaluate how well someone demonstrates those competencies. So zooming in on the required competencies first. When we go from identifying, we identified 8 competencies, 5 of them being required. It's a deal breaker if you don't have them. You got to walk in the door pretty much having these 5 competencies, and those preferred ones we can train you for. So notice now that I'm focusing just on the required competencies, the 5 required competencies. If you haven't read them, you want to make sure to read them now. So we've switched to competencies, and then we took it a step further by defining a competency. And this is also from workshop 1. This is super important that we are defining them using a formula. Do something to achieve something. Okay, so for example, you see process improvement. Well, what does that mean for a recruiter? What does that mean? Well, it means that you're going to monitor and evaluate. There's your action verbs. What are you going to do it to? Recruiting processes and recruiting and sourcing methods. What's the outcome that you will achieve by doing that? Improve the quality of candidates and reduce time to hire. That is a super tight competency definition. It gives the candidate it's very specific information on what is going to be expected, and also it provides some criteria for evaluating them later. So my HR people in the room, time to hire, you guys know that, you have that metric handy. I bet you know it right off the top of your head what your time to hire is. That's something that we can measure, right? So later in the process, when we start doing performance evaluations, we could refer back to the competency that was there the very first time you laid eyes on this job opening. So this is super important. The last thing to note about competencies is early in the hiring process, we screen out people who do not have required competencies. Later, we will use those preferred competencies that I showed you a minute ago to screen in. So again, I want to really harp on this definition, this formula for writing inclusive competency definitions. So for interviewing and assessment, here's what you're going to do. Action verb, what you're going to do it to, and to achieve what outcome. So this not only helps an applicant understand what the job is, it's going to help us today in today's workshop to align different expectations. So we're not all looking at bus driver, right? We are looking at clear definitions that help us align from the recruiter to the hiring manager to the HR director. Everyone's on the same page and it's outcome focused. Again, so we can use after hire to measure productivity. So we want to focus on outcomes, not behaviors. This is another example of where bias creeps into the hiring process, is when we make expectations of behaviors rather than of outcomes. So action verb, activity in which the employee uses the competency, and expected outcome. So this is all still, we're all still kind of recapping our previous workshops here. So in workshop 2, we talked a lot about skills-based interviewing, because I feel that this is one of the part of the process that is most subjective. I mean, how many times have you had a panel interview and some people think, oh, wow, that person totally flubbed the interview. Someone else on the panel is like, oh man, they aced it. So you know what I'm talking about. What are some of the questions we love to hate, right? Does anybody have just an interview question that just makes you groan? You know what I'm talking about. Asking about strengths and weaknesses. Yes. Thank you, Jolene. Anybody else got one that you absolutely hate? You know, why do you want this position? Detail oriented. All right. I appreciate you guys being engaged. Thank you. Why should I hire you? Oh, groan. Okay, so why do these questions persist? You know, like, what's your greatest weakness, right? Oh, I'm a workaholic, right? So I groan, eye roll. So why do these kind of questions persist? It's because companies are trying to evaluate fit, right? And traditionally interviews are used or misused, in my opinion, to assess culture fit. And that's not an effective way to assess if someone can actually do the job or not. This approach often results in people being hired because we like them, right? Rather than they're the most qualified candidates, even with the best intentions, because we're focusing on this, are they a good fit for us, right? And this was a pet peeve for me. When I ran talent acquisition for a call center, I consistently put forth candidates who were declined by hires up for other, not a good fit. Like, well, what does that even mean, right? And so in terms of culture fit, we shouldn't be trying to screen out people who don't fit the culture we already have. We should be taking a culture add approach. A culture add approach. How does the diverse background of someone who's different from me bring something new to the organization, right? To invigorate and help our culture grow. Instead of trying to fit them into existing cultural norms, why don't we celebrate difference and appreciate that someone different from ourselves might actually enrich the culture? So skills-based interviewing is going to do away with all that, tell me about yourself and, all that kind of stuff. We should try to assess if the candidate has the right skills instead of subconsciously hiring people who reflect our own personal experiences and pathways to success. So that's what we're trying to do with skills-based interviewing. So the key to that, there's 4 keys to that. Number 1, most important, behavioral and situational questions. And my HR director's in the room. There's a bunch of them today. You guys know what we're talking about. Behavioral questions focused on past behaviors, asking a candidate how they've used a specific competency before. So for example, tell me about a time. Often these questions start with, tell me about a time, right? Tell me about a time in which you had to improve the job postings at your organization. What did you do to make those improvements? That's a behavioral question. Situational questions focus on hypotheticals. So what would you do, right? So here's a situation that you might come across working for us. What would you do? So that's asking them to tell us how they would use the competency. And we need to make sure to focus on a specific competency when we're asking interview questions. So a competency that can be easily evaluated and is not multi-part. Because multi-part questions that are trying to evaluate more than one competency, those are really difficult to answer, and also difficult for an interviewer to separate out their evaluation of those individual competencies and judge that candidate fairly against another candidate. So focus on one specific competency and only one specific competency, and make sure that you're writing inclusive questions, avoiding personal questions that directly or indirectly ask about someone's personal life, common entry point for bias in the hiring process. So for example, what do you enjoy doing in your spare time? Seems like a fairly innocuous question, right? It's an icebreaker. We're just trying to get to know you, right? Well, this is not a skills-based question. It is not good to ask this in an interview. It's not behavioral. It's not situational. It doesn't ask about any competency at all. And it is an entry point for bias. That person is going to answer honestly, and maybe they tell you about some hobby that you don't care for at all. Doesn't have anything to do with the job. It's not a competency. So we want to shift to something like this. A skills-based behavioral question. Tell me about a time in which remember the tell me about a time start? That's the common start for behavioral question. Tell me about a time in which you had a difficult time filling a role. How did you adapt? How did you change up your recruitment techniques to better attract candidates? Super laser focused on a skills-based approach, in particular, behavioral question about a single competency, process improvement, right? How did they improve their process to better attract candidates? That is one of our 5 required competencies for this example position that we're using in this training series, recruiter. Another way that we can screen people fairly and remove bias from the process is by using work assignments. These are far underutilized in my experience with HR processes. So after the interview, as we're nearing the end of the screening process, as I mentioned earlier, we shift from screening out candidates who don't have required competencies to screening in the finalists who do have the required competencies. Now we want to look for the preferred competencies. So skills-based hiring encourages the use of other screening tools in addition to interview questions. Interviews are good. You have to do interviews, right? But interview questions have their limitations. You know, even when you take a skills-based approach to interviewing, all interview questions still depend on the candidate's ability to talk about their competencies and your ability to pick out, you know, the part where they're actually addressing that. So a work assignment is a great example of an alternative screening tool. They go beyond the conversation and ask candidates to show, don't tell, demonstrate your competencies in a simulation that replicates the work they will actually do on a job. So we'll, for example, here's an example on the screen. So we're going to take a preferred competency, the competency of persuasion, and this is going to lead into our first activity for today. So make sure you're paying attention. Our preferred competency, persuasion, right? So we identified in the job description what task the competency would be commonly used for. So for example, recruiters, how would they use persuasion? Well, they would do some passive recruiting, right? Maybe they go on LinkedIn and they're writing persuasive LinkedIn messages to top candidates, people who are passive candidates, they haven't applied for an open position, and we want to encourage them to apply. This particular work assignment does actually clearly touch on another competency as well, which is writing. That is one of our 5 required competencies for the job of recruiter. So we're basically going to do a simulation. We're going to give an applicant an overview of a specific position and ask them to write a persuasive LinkedIn message as if they were recruiting passive applicants for that position. So here's where we start jumping into the spreadsheet. So that's the spreadsheet that I emailed out. So you'll see this on line 77. This is where we left off in 102. This is kind of the last thing we did. We were setting up different screening tools, interview questions, work assignments, and we did some even before that too. I'm kind of skipping ahead, but we did pre-screening. So now it's time to select candidates who best demonstrate our desired competencies. So this is a good time for you to take a look at that spreadsheet. Notice that there are many tabs on that spreadsheet. So when you open that spreadsheet, you may have to click the little arrow at the bottom left. There's some left and right arrows. You may have to click left and right to see all of the tabs. Primarily, we work on the leftmost tab, the first tab, which is called hiring templates, I believe. That is the where we are right now. Line 77 of that. This is where we ended workshop 102. We designed a work assignment. So now we're moving into new material for the course. That's pretty much the end of the wrap up right there. So let's start that with an activity. So I'm going to show you a sample that someone submitted for this work assignment. So we've got our finalists, we've done our interviews. Now it's time to select a candidate, and we want to evaluate how well they did on this work assignment. So I'm going to show you a LinkedIn message that this candidate submitted, and then I will give you a structure to evaluate it, and we'll see if your opinion changes. So here we go. I'll give you a few minutes to read this LinkedIn message. And then I'm going to ask you how good was this person's writing? How persuasive was this? I'll be back in a minute. Okay, so how are we feeling about this LinkedIn message? Unmute yourself or type in the chat. How good was the author's writing? In fact, let's do a poll. Okay, Jolene says better than most.
I think it was okay. I would have liked the recruiter to introduce themselves first sentence, and give more of the what's in it for me for the person they're recruiting, versus just talking about the company and how they've been growing, but really what's in it for them.
Excellent. That is really great insight. Thank you. I've got a poll up on the screen now. So tell me, great, good, okay, poor, terrible. Just off the cuff, without having really any criteria to go off of, what would you say? How good was the author's writing?
It seemed really good at first, and then when I reread it, I realized that talking to engineers, probably really informal conversation language, is probably not consistent with trying to recruit engineers.
Interesting. Yeah, that's some really good insight.
I was confused because I wasn't really 100% sure what the position was that they were recruiting for.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I felt like putting that information in specifically how much they've grown, for me, it would almost scare me to want to. I mean, yeah, it's great to work for a company that's growing, but a company that's grown 349% in a year, what extra stuff would I be having to take on if we grow that much in the next year?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so everyone's answered the poll, and okay, so the poll results show a pretty wide spread. There is an equal number of people that say this is a good message as to the number of people who say this is a poor message, about 22% in each category. So we have a pretty wide spread on what you guys think about this message, and that's exactly what I expected, because we haven't yet introduced some sort of standard for how to do this. So we have answers that are ranging pretty widely, and that is pretty common because there's discrepancies in the hiring process as to how they're evaluating the competencies. So this is what we really need to get into for today, is moving to a skills-based approach to this. Some more good comments in the chat, if you have a chance to read them, from Sally and Melanie. Thank you guys. This is really what the point of what we're getting at for today, is that instead of evaluating candidates using credentials and unclear processes that are essentially proxies for success, we need to validate competencies, and we need to have guidelines in order to do that. So we have agreed upon expectations so that everyone on this call today is assessing that message using the same criteria. And that will often help us get bias out of the system as well. Now, a lot of times companies will tell me that they fight bias by having a very diverse panel of people. So more cooks in the kitchen, and they're all very different, and that's going to root out the bias. That is well-meaning, but that typically only compounds the issue if you don't have clear expectations of what a good LinkedIn message is versus what a bad one is. You're only compounding the issue of bias without actually improving the effectiveness of the candidate rating process. So you can't just throw more people at the problem. You have to have selection guidelines. And that is what we are talking about. So I'm going to give you a formula for today. And this is actually really the main lesson for today, is this formula. So we are going to introduce a scoring system. So for example, for the competency of writing, let's say the competency of writing, so not specifically persuasion, but just writing in general, let's set up a scale. Let's say 1 to 5, right? The exact numbers don't matter as much as the consistency in how it's applied. Whatever scale you pick, use that same scale for all parts of the process. So we are all evaluating on the same number scale. Then within that, break down that competency into its key components. into its key components. So for writing, what does it mean to be a good writer, right? What are the different parts of that? And then we are going to define 1 to 5. Let's say we're using 1 to 5. What does a 1 look like? What does a 2 look like? So on and so forth. So here's an example using the preferred competency of persuasion. So I've broken, so what does it mean to be persuasive? So what we did as a hiring team is we broke down what persuasion means to us. Connecting with the candidate, grabbing their attention, and being authentic and genuine, right? So we decided those are the 3 components that we're looking for. That's how we define persuasion. So using this grid that you see, many of you know a word for this. It's called a rubric, right? So I have a side gig in academia. I teach at IU, at Indiana University. And the class that I teach is mostly very subjective material. It's a writing course, specifically news writing. And we all know, news stories have to have the basics, right? Who, what, when, where, why, how. But this is a very subjective class to grade. So I know exactly what this rubric is getting at because it gives me some clear definitions for what good writing is so that I can demonstrate those expectations to my students and also so they know what they're being graded upon, and we can identify what are the important parts of good writing in the example that we're going to have you guys do here in a minute. So for this example of persuasion, you see I've already done that. So we defined the 3 components of persuasion, and then we just wrote a few words about what's bad connect, what's great connect, right? So we actually defined each number. So I'm not just like, no, I feel like a 3 today. We're actually going to use that language that's in each one of those boxes to score the applicant. So now let's try this again. Let's try this again. So I'm putting the same LinkedIn message on the screen, but now I'm going to give you selection guidelines to use to score this message using a rubric. So you can find this in your spreadsheet. I'm also going to put it on the screen, but you can find this in your spreadsheet that I sent you. There's a tab that says WA Guide. That stands for Work Assignment Guide. So you can use that, or I will put it on the screen here. So here is that persuasion rubric and also the actual message. So now take a few minutes to score based on connecting with the candidate, grabbing attention, and being genuine or authentic. And go ahead and put your score in the chat. So give me 3 numbers. So for example, here, I'll do it in the chat. So I'm going to say 333. So I'm going to score like that. So I'm going to give you a few minutes and I want you guys to put your scores in the chat. And let's see how we score this now that we have some criteria, a rubric to score it on. I'll give you a couple minutes.
So Chad, which one? Are we doing all 3 or just the first one?
Oh, just the first one. Yeah. In the spreadsheet, there are actually 3 examples. That's for the in-person version of this workshop where we go a little bit deeper than we do the virtual one. So no, just the first one. So the one that you see on the screen, this is in the spreadsheet, it's candidate 1. All right, we're seeing scores start to come in. Thank you, Brooke. Thank you, Claudia. We'll give everyone else a few minutes to score. Give us 3 numbers: connect, grab attention, and genuine. What are your scores? Scott says 233. Thank you, Scott. Scott's from Unite Indy. Sandra says 223. She's HR at Sitel. Thank you guys for being here. A lot of partners on the call today. I see Engaging Solutions. So already I'm seeing a little bit more consistency. There's still going to be outliers, but I'm seeing 223, 233, 222. I'm starting to see, if we charted this into a spreadsheet, we would start to see that we are maybe getting closer to scoring the same way. And that's really the point of what we're doing here. Great stuff. Thank you guys so much. Now let's go a step further. Let's set the lowest bar. So let's decide, okay, on the 1 to 5 scale, before we even look at any, let's agree on what our minimum proficiency is. We have to agree on that before we look at even the first one. So this is going to depend largely on how much bandwidth we have to do the training. What are we willing to accept, right? So let's say, so on the screen right now, you see I've set it at 2, right? Which is actually on a 1 to 5 scale. That's kind of low, right? That's like poor, right? It's not even, it's below average. Maybe there are some cases where we would accept a 2, or we might not wash out that candidate based on one score of 2. Maybe we're identifying where we can train. So maybe if we have a candidate that is, low on persuasion, but high on everything else, well, maybe we're willing to do that and just train that person, right? Or maybe if it's a key proficiency like writing, maybe we're going to move that bar up. Maybe we're going to say, hey, you know what? You've got to walk in the door with at least a 3 score on writing. We can't really go below that. So again, it depends on whether it's a required competency or a preferred competency and what your ability to train for is. So you got to have those kind of discussions before you score anybody, really. The important part is the framework. And notice too, not to get too deep in the weeds here, but I've also seen situations where we do adjust it upwards after we start screening if we have a ton of qualified candidates. So let's say you've got just a huge number of people who hit all of your required competencies, and you want to kind of raise the bar a little bit. Maybe you move your minimum up. But writing is a required competency, so we're going to stick at least 3. I would say for persuasion, maybe we can bump that down to a 2. So let's give this a try. So we want you guys to actually come up with a rubric now for selection guidelines for writing, the competency of writing. So you'll do this on your spreadsheet, the hiring templates tab, which is the first tab on the spreadsheet. Remember, you might have to hit the left arrow to scoot all the way over so that you can see that first tab in the spreadsheet. And we're at line 97. What we want you guys to do is basically fill out the chart, fill out the table, break down that competency to 3 components. What do you mean when you say good writing? What are those the 3 most important parts of writing? And then give us a definition for each of the 1 to 5 levels. So we're going to do this in small groups. So on the screen right now, you can see what we want you to do. You actually have to fill this out, all the stuff that's in brackets. Now on the screen, I've given you an example. You don't have to use this example, but here's what we use at the media school at IU. So when I teach my journalism class at Indiana University, my rubric for writing has 3 components: content, organization, and mechanics. Now I go a step further even. We weight those. Weight, W-E-I-G-H-T. We give more weight to content, then second weight to organization, mechanics being a distant third because that is easier to train for and improve for. So don't want to get too deep into the weeds there, but you can also weight these different components depending on how valuable they are. So that's what we want you guys to do, is go into the spreadsheet, line 97, in small groups and decide what are the 3 components of good writing, and then come up with some score descriptions for doing them. So let me see if I can do some breakout rooms.
Could you repeat again which tab?
Yeah, it's the first tab in the spreadsheet. It's called Hiring Templates.
Thank you.
And it's the leftmost tab. There's so many tabs in that spreadsheet, you might have to scroll left or right before you see it. So I'm going to go ahead and put everyone into breakout rooms, and we'll give you, let's say 8 to 10 minutes to come up with basically a rubric. Fill out this chart to come up with a selection guide for the competency of writing. And here we go. All right, guys, welcome back. How did it go? I would love to see if anyone felt good about what they did in breaking down writing into different components and scoring that. I'm sorry that I didn't give you more time. I actually think I cut you off at least a minute early. I thought in Zoom when you close the rooms that it gives you 2 minutes instead of 1. So I think I cut you off at least a minute early. I'm so sorry, guys. But hopefully you got to do a little bit of networking as well. Does anyone feel good about what they, would anybody be willing to share their screen for a minute and show us what they came up with? Anybody?
I can.
Awesome. Thank you. Brooke, go ahead. Share your screen.
So we ironically were all 3 from the same company in our group together. So which made it nice because then we viewed the writing skill as somebody who works for a call center who is either doing outreach or responding to issues. So we said, you know, 1, we would like them to make sure they're using the appropriate software mechanics. Are they putting a subject, something in the subject line? Are they, you know, do they even know how to use all the email appropriately? Do they have professional and clear language? Obviously, we want it to be professional. We want it to be grammatically correct. And then for us, because we're working with customers, we want there to be some form of connection established, some relationship building. We want them to show empathy if we need to within their writing and those types of things. So that's what we came up with.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm sorry I didn't give you guys more time to come up with the individual descriptions of what a 1 looks like, what a 2 looks like, but I think you get the idea. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much for that feedback. And because you're making a great segue to our final step here as well, in terms of training to specific competencies and specific components within competencies, because you guys have such specific needs for what good writing looks like for you, we're going to make sure to carry those components forward into the next step, onboarding. So that's a great segue. So thank you so much for that. So you can do this not just for writing assignments. Many of you might find this most effective for interviews. Because as I said earlier, how many times have you thought that a candidate totally flubbed an interview and then someone else on the hiring panel is like, oh, they were great. Oh, I loved them, right? So what you see on the screen right now is a screenshot from a tab in your spreadsheet called Interview Guide. So it's a couple tabs over from the leftmost tab. It's called Interview Guide. And on this one, I've taken that same concept. We take a competency, we have an interview question that speaks specifically to that competency, and then we score. We're using, in this example, I'm using a 1 to 5 score, and those are pretty standard, terrible to excellent. And then I'm identifying, and some of you didn't get this far in the breakout exercise we just did, but you notice how I created specific language for each category so that we can all get on the same page. So at the one end of the spectrum, the interviewee did not provide a compelling example, nor did they communicate clearly in their answer to the question about when they had to improve a process. On the other end of it, they provided an excellent example and they communicated it very well. So you can vary the language there, but it basically goes from very poor to excellent. And then we would have our hiring panel or our HR staff score each candidate in that category. So this methodology is useful for any stage of evaluation, not just work assignments. We used work assignments because that, it's a little bit easier, to do that in a Zoom exercise rather than a mock interview or something. But this methodology is good for any stage of the evaluation, especially in-person panel interviews. So check out that tab in your spreadsheet. It's called Interview Guide. It's like the 3rd or 4th tab from the left in the spreadsheet. There's so many tabs in that spreadsheet that you might have to do the left and right arrows at the bottom left to find the tab that you're looking for. So bringing it all together, this is also a tab in your spreadsheet. There's a tab that says Scoring Guide that shows you an example of where we would bring all of the scores from the different parts of the process into one summary page. So now, by bringing all those numbers into one page, now we can score side by side. And we can also root out discrepancies too. So if we see that one person on the hiring panel is consistently scoring way off from other people, or if we see the same work assignment scored vastly different by different people, then we know that there might be some area in the process, right? Because we've got that easy comparison between candidate and between assignment. So looking at this, now we've got a numerical table, basically, that takes all the different parts, the pre-screening, resume review, interview, work assignments, all of those on a master page where we can show where our candidates are strong or weak. So you can see in this example, the candidate that we're hiring actually is below where we want them to be on one of the competencies, but it's a preferred competency. So we've decided that for preferred competencies, even though our minimum is 3, we'll hire below 2. We'll hire at 2. We will hire below 3. But it means that we're going to have to do some training for that candidate. But that candidate 2 scored high in this hypothetical example in all of our required competencies. The 5 competencies that we decided in the very first workshop in the Skillful series that were key for a recruiter. So persuasion, the candidate 2, the one that we're hiring, is weak on persuasion, but their overall score is the highest, and the competency that they're low in can be trained for. And we have, let's say, maybe we have some bandwidth within our company to do that, but we can also seek external sources for that as well. And that's where we're going to go next as we wrap up today's workshop with how to translate this into onboarding. Also, it would be good to note that notice the candidate 2 and 3 are very close, like score-wise, they're very close. So that might prompt some additional review and discussion as well as to, which candidates, why are we picking 2 over 3 when they're only 0.3 of a point over? That might prompt some conversations as well. That's really individual decision for your team to make. So carrying this on over into onboarding. So this is where we're going to close out today. The main issue that I see with companies that I've worked with is that they do orientation and call it onboarding. So orientation is mostly administrative stuff. So that day one stuff of filling out paperwork and giving the tour around the building and getting your badge. And like I said at the beginning, you know, dimming the lights while they take the picture of my bald head. That stuff is all orientation. That's not onboarding at all. Onboarding and new hire paperwork are not the same thing. Onboarding is a lot more work and takes a lot more thought than just the new hire paperwork, right? So our goal in skills-based hiring is to carry these lessons from the first couple workshops and what we've done here today into the future, and a plan that's relevant to the new hires' needs to get them up to full productivity as quickly as possible. We're going to reduce turnover, improve their integration into the team, get productivity up and get it up faster. So with this process, the focus is on skill development. So based on, and we prioritize which competencies are most important. We already hired someone that fits our required competencies, and we know persuasion is the one that we're weak on for the one that we hired, right? So now we're going to talk about that. So here are the 4 components of skills-based onboarding. So it's important that you have some inclusion of all 4 of these in your onboarding process. Most of you have at least 2 or 3 of them, but do you have all of them? So training, so formal training for a role on one or more competency, especially preferred competencies that are lower than the minimum proficiency, as we just saw in the candidate that our team decided to hire. Again, we're going to go further in that in 104. So I hope you guys will join us on July 8th when we close out the series and really go deep into that. Coaching and mentorship. So peer-to-peer learning, supervisor coaching, really necessary for a new hire to learn the specifics of how those competencies that we know they have will actually be applied to the job. Coaching and mentorship. Also interpersonal, so relationships, and not just inside the organization, but external to the organization as well. So when I first onboarded at CareSource, I went to Ohio and shadowed the person who has the Ohio version of my job for a day. And the main thing that we did is get out. We'd get out of the office and we went and met with our partners. This is pre-COVID, of course. We went out and shook hands and met with our partners so I could get a real feel for how those relationships were so key to our partner development for our program. And then finally, administrative, you got to have some of those. So that's, giving login information, for the different systems and all that. That's more of the, sort of paperwork and basic stuff. But you really need to have all 4 of those components. So full onboarding plans are going to cover all of the competencies that we identified in earlier stages of the process. But for this person that we just hired, this example, let's sketch out a plan that is going to take special care to cover the competencies that we know the person we just hired is going to need a little extra help with. So I've just put arrows on the 4 competencies, 2 of them preferred and 2 of them required, that this new hire scored lowest on. So now we need to put some thought into how are we going to help them boost those up? Again, a proper onboarding plan covers every competency. You've got to have some idea of how you're going to onboard that person for every competency, but we want to take special care on the ones that they scored the lowest on. So let's go back into the breakout groups, and I'm going to ask you guys to brainstorm some ideas for onboarding, for boosting up competencies in your organization specifically. So let's say that you hired a recruiter at your company, the company that you work for right now. What are the things that someone outside of that organization doesn't know and need to know coming in? That insider knowledge. This is a huge stumbling block for onboarding, that people assume that other people know stuff when some of those resources are internal. So company specifics. What's unique about each of these competencies as it applies to your organization? So for this, I think this is the last exercise. So for this exercise, we'll just use your own organization. So in your breakout groups, choose one of the organizations that one of you works for and just talk about the company specifics. Are there any special offerings or processes or relationships or knowledge that would help a new candidate gain the most from their onboarding? So specifically, we want you to look at these 4. Try to get through at least one of them. We'll give you 7 minutes, so hopefully you can get through a couple of them. So talk about at least one of these competencies: process improvement, writing, employment law, or persuasion, or all of them if you can get through all of that. So we're going back to the spreadsheet, the first tab, the hiring templates tab, and we're in 105. Row 105 is where we're at, and we're going to define how those competencies apply to your organization. Because again, a big part of the onboarding is removing those stumbling blocks to the insider knowledge, right? And making sure that we are utilizing the resources we have within our company. And then we will look outside of the company for resources to improve competencies as well. We will close with that when we come back. So I'm going to go ahead and put you into the breakout groups. Here's an example that I'm going to put up on the screen. And in this example, I've covered all 8 of the competencies and given a specific on how that competency is used at the company and what resources we might have in the company that would help with that. So that's what we want you to do in the breakouts. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the breakout rooms right now and work on that row in the spreadsheet. And the breakout rooms are now open. All right, and we are all back. Sorry again, I did not give you more time. I'm hearing that that we want more time in breakout rooms in future workshops. I definitely will accommodate that. I just knew that we had to do a lot of recap today. I wanted to be respectful of everyone's time and make sure that we end on time, which we will, because we're almost done. There's one final step that we would use in the onboarding process. Going from what the exercise that you guys just did on the first tab of the worksheet, we would now go to there's an onboarding guide tab in that spreadsheet as well. It is, I think it's the rightmost tab. So you've got to do some left-right scrolling through the tabs to find it. But this is where the onboarding plan lands. A robust skills-based onboarding plan. Again, there's a template for this final step on the onboarding guide tab in the spreadsheet. And you'll notice that it has a drop down in the column of category. You can actually drop down and choose from those 4 key components of a skills-based onboarding plan. So training, coaching and mentorship, interpersonal, and administration. So remember that as you design a final onboarding plan that can be actually used by your hiring managers, you've got to add in every competency, even the ones that they scored high on in the initial screening process, with specific steps to get the new hire up to speed on each one, what category it falls into, and an estimated timing of the step as well. So you'll find that on the onboarding guide tab in the spreadsheet. And we'll actually come back to that in workshop 4 because we're going to take that plan and move it forward to keep this employee and nurture their development. Before I do a wrap up, did anybody come up with anything cool from the breakout exercise that we just did? Anything cool that your company does in terms of internal coaching, training, mentorship? I would love to hear about something cool that somebody's doing. If anyone came up with any examples of that in the group activity you just did. Is anybody doing anything cool? Nobody's doing anything cool? I know that's not true. All right, well, we're all tired and we're almost done. So I will tell you that again, in addition to the internal stuff that you do, many external resources are available as well, and you can engage through those through Skillful and Next Level Jobs and DWD as well. So we'll go ahead and wrap up then with the summary here of skills-based onboarding. So I put this stat out when I first invited you guys to this workshop. This workshop carries SHRM certification, and the SHRM Foundation found that if you do a structured plan like this, that your employees are 69% more likely to stay for 3 years longer than their counterparts who don't get that. The case study that Skillful has for the work that they've done is in Colorado. So Skillful is new to Indiana. In fact, this whole workshop series, you're part of a test run. I forgot to mention that you guys are guinea pigs right now. We are testing out this series of workshops to see if this would be something that that I can offer to my 200 plus employer partners on an annual basis. So the test pilot for this Skillful project was actually in Colorado. And they contracted with the health department in Colorado. And they found that by using this plan, they decreased onboarding time from 5 to 6 months to mere weeks in terms of how quickly someone got measurably proficient in their new job duties, from time to hire to being completely onboarded. So we really appreciate that you being here today. The next installment in this series is the final installment, the most popular one, retention, focusing on developing the talent you've already got. We all know it's cheaper to keep the staff you have than hire new ones. And you're probably not surprised to know that there's national surveys that show the lack of career growth opportunities. That's a major reason why people leave their job. But here's a cool part about Workshop 4. A promotion isn't necessarily the answer. A promotion isn't the only way to deal with that problem. In fact, sometimes it's not the best solution at all. So, and I connect with this personally as well. So I've worked for CareSource for almost 4 years. In that time, I've not been promoted once, not a single time. And you know what? I'm not actually even mad about that. My job has no direct reports. And has no plans to create any direct reports. I am essentially like sort of an independent workforce development agent for CareSource. They have done a ton of development in me. I feel very happy in my position. I have no desire to look elsewhere for employment, despite the fact that I've never been promoted even once, and I'm not likely to be either. So there are other techniques that you can use in terms of professional development, things like job enrichment and job enlargement. Some of you, the SHRM folks, will know those terms already. We will get into that in Workshop 4. So CareSource has invested a lot of resources in me to make me a subject matter expert internally and externally, and to help me feel fulfilled in the job that I do. So getting someone direct reports, promoting them to manager, that isn't always the answer. And a lot of times that's not an option anyway in a particular situation. So we will talk about that in Workshop 4. That is July 7th from 10 a.m. to noon. I will send you the invite. Also, I encourage you to learn more about the program that I work for, CareSource Job Connect. It's caresource.com/IN for Indiana. We have a contract with the state to manage Medicaid for Indiana, essentially, the Healthy Indiana Plan, Hoosier Healthwise. Also, people are always asking for a blank version of the spreadsheet that we use today so that you could use that for any job. So I will send that out. I'll send you links to this recording. I will send you links to the previous recordings as well. And I hope to see you on July 7th. Thanks so much, everyone. Appreciate your time. Thanks for being here. Special thanks to all of our partners who came out today. I appreciate you guys.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.